Happy Friday, Baylor College of Medicine and friends of Baylor. There is a huge biological event just waiting to happen this year. You know what it is? It is the emergence of the 17-year cicadas. Now, everyone knows the sound of a cicada. It reminds you of the end of summer, going back to college. They emerge every year, late in July and August. You hear them timbling, making their noises to meet a mate. But every 17 and 13 years, there's a group of cicadas that end up emerging in mass amounts. Now, you might wonder, why would I care about this? Well, first of all, you probably don't know this, but I was an entomology major in college. Not etymology, not study of words, but study of insects. And I actually got a degree from the Wildlife and Fisheries College at University of Michigan. And the reason I got into these, because when I was a kid in a boarding school in Ohio, I was around an emergence of the 17-year cicadas, and they just took over the town. I mean, completely. There were millions of these things. And as only a 15-year-old could do, we filled up buckets of them and threw them under the sheets of our roommates and filled their shoes with them. It plugged a few into the walls. I know that's not probably a good idea. But it was just massive cicada town, and I was always fascinated by these things. So when I got to college, that's what I studied. And these things are amazing. I mean, they emerge every 17 years in the Midwest and the Northeast, and 13 years in the South. And they're perfectly designed. And it's been an interesting science around why they have this periodicity. Most people think it's because of the advancing and retraction of glaciers. And by staying underground, they're eating at roots of trees, and they can actually detect when the glaciers are retreating. So this periodicity will allow them to emerge when the glaciers were gone or had retreated. It also allowed them to avoid predators, because there's no predator that has a 17-year cycle to eat cicadas. The one thing that's really amazing is they also come out in masses, so that even if every predator ate them all, they'd still have enough around to mate. And so they're just millions of these, billions of these. And it's quite an interesting thing. The mystery is why 13 and 17 were prime numbers. Why would that be? And I've always wondered about this, but I think I finally understand the reason now, or at least I'm beginning to understand. You may say, well, what does this have to do with SARS? Okay, well, I was watching Robert Redfield being interviewed, Robert Redfield, the former director of the CDC, being interviewed by Sanjay Gupta on CNN. And he asked him what he thought the origin of SARS-CoV-2 was. And he said, in all honesty, he believed because it was so perfectly designed to infect people that it must have been made by man in a laboratory or escaped from a laboratory. So now I know. These cicadas were made somewhere in a laboratory by man. That's the only way they could be so perfectly designed to avoid predators and come up every 17 years. So thank you, Dr. Redfield, for that. I mean, really, sometimes you wonder, people don't believe in natural selection or the ability to evolve defense mechanisms. It's kind of amazing. But we're not going to talk about the origin of SARS-CoV-2. We know where the origin is. Our microbiome group published a paper long ago about the acquisition of the pangolin spike, which allowed it to become infectious for man, and it was a natural event. So let's talk about what's happening in the world today. Things aren't going so well. I was very optimistic last week. This week I'm less optimistic. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the world, there's been a big spike, especially in Europe and South America. And I just started looking at the countries that I want to visit. France is up. Italy is up. It looks like it might have finally peaked in Italy. That's a good thing. But it's a huge spike and now up. And Brazil, where I want to go see some soccer, it's just out of control. Brazil is completely out of control and continues to just rise and rise and rise. So, relative to that, we're doing better than Europe and South America. But there's a little bit of a concern. You know, we've been watching this over the last few days. For the last week or so, we've stopped going down, and in fact, the last few days we're going up again. So we had almost now 60,000 a few days ago, now 70,000 cases. And if you look at the curve, it's slowly but surely beginning to rise. If you recall, we've been following the IHME projections, and when you look at their projections, they had three scenarios. One was, you know, that we wore masks and followed rules. We'd be done with this by summer. The other is if we stayed doing what we currently are doing, maintain the normal mask orders we have, and just increase vaccinations, we'd be done with this by midsummer. But if we increase mobility and we start removing all these mask mandates, this is what happens. We see a slight bump upward, and then it stays with many, many cases well into the summer. And if you look at what are we tracking to, it looks to me like we're tracking to the worst case scenario. Now, last week I said we were somewhere in between the worst case scenario and a good one. I think it's looking more and more like we are going to begin to see a rise and have a bump. Last weekend, or we set for spring break, set a record for travel. So once again, mobility is going up with everyone. State after state is getting rid of masking orders, and so I don't see that we're going to be done with this by midsummer as we had all hoped. And the other thing is, remember, we've talked about these variants. The places that are really going up now are in New England. New England states, the top 10 increases per capita are in the New England states. Michigan is a complete mess. And there are parts of Texas that are going up as well. So when you think about where are those places that are going up, it's where the variants are. So we're having a lot of problem with these variants. Now, if you look at what's happening at the Texas Medical Center, it's just as I've said. It's our number is persistently stuck at 1. We just don't seem to be able to get it below 1, and that's a real problem. Our test positivity has been consistently below 5% now, so that's good. But we're getting fewer and fewer tests, so I don't really know what that means, especially when we have 1,000 cases a day. And as I've said many, many times, we have to be around under 200, closer to 50 cases a day before we go back to behaving normally. We are nowhere near, and right now it looks like we're ticking up. So that's a real problem. And you can really see this failure to continue to fall here in the 7-day rolling average, which is just stuck on a plateau. And unfortunately, every time we hit a plateau, we tend to have a surge after that plateau. Now, if you look at where the variants, the UK variant is all over the place now. It's in Florida, in California, it's in pretty substantially in Michigan and the Northeast, as well as in Texas. And the Brazilian variant's in Texas, and the South African variant is around too. So we are really seeing the emergence of these variants. UK in particular is emerging in the United States, and will probably become the dominant strain fairly soon. So why are these variants important? Well, we start thinking about the vaccine efficacy. It's really important. So there's a study in the New England Journal that came out that looked at neutralizing antibodies generated by each of the vaccines and to the variants. So as you know, the J&J vaccine is the single dose, 65% effective in clinical trials against mild disease, 85% effective against severe disease. It drops to 57% effective in mild and remains at 85% for severe with the South African variant. If you look at Pfizer and Moderna, those two vaccines are about the same. When you look at neutralization, the UK variant is about 2-fold reduced. The Brazilian and South African variants about 6 to 8-fold reduction. Now, just because it's not as effective, 6 or 8-fold, isn't that bad, because we may well have 100 times more antibody than we need to actually be protective. So those are reasonable numbers. Unfortunately, the AstraZeneca one is 86-fold reduced. In other words, it pretty much doesn't work. And there was a study that just came out also in the New England Journal looking at AstraZeneca's effectiveness in a clinical trial. and it was actually only 10% effective against the South African variant. So AstraZeneca, unfortunately, it's a big problem because that is the main vaccine that has been used in Europe. Right now, they have the UK variant there, and it will work against the UK variant, so they need to get that vaccine going as fast as they can before the South African variant shows up. And this is all why progress towards vaccination of our country is so critically important. We're in a race between these variants emerging and having enough people vaccinated that we can be resistant to them. So if you look at the progress, we're doing really well. We have almost now 100 million people have received at least one dose of a vaccine. That's a third of the population. Now, if you think about another 30% being infected, we're getting. We still have a long way to go, but at least we're getting there. And we've done a really great job of vaccinating those over 65. It's almost 75% of the people over 65 have been vaccinated. And Pfizer and Moderna are the dominant vaccines in the United States. J&J is just getting started. But J&J should play a huge role, particularly in single-dose vaccines. As I've said many times, every kid on a college campus ought to get that J&J vaccine right now. We shouldn't let a kid on a college campus get away without being vaccinated. I mean, they are spreading it around. They're doing their stuff in Miami and in Texas. We got to get those kids vaccinated because they're not behaving as we want them to behave. And here in the greater Houston region, we've exceeded for the first time 1 million vaccinated people. So think about it. We have 7 million people in the greater Houston area. We're trying to get 4.5 to 5 million either vaccinated or previously infected to reach herd immunity. So we've done 1 million vaccines. We think 30% of the population's been infected. That's 2.1 million people. So we have about 4 million people who should be resistant, but we need to get to 4.5 to 5. So we got a ways to go. Still, we need to vaccinate another 1 million people. So there's a lot of good news that came out this week, though, from many different papers, but 3 in the New England Journal this week, that have shown that vaccines in the real world work. It's one thing to do a clinical trial and show efficacy. It's another thing when you go out and start vaccinating people. Not under controlled conditions, not with study coordinators, but just everybody getting vaccinated. It's often less effective, but it's been shown to be very, very effective. So there was a CDC study of 4,000 people, showed that 1 dose is 80% effective and 2 doses are 90% effective with the mRNA vaccines. Now, there's a lot of talk, well, why don't we just get 1 vaccine then? Well, the reason is these variants. We need to get as high an antibody titer as we can get to make sure that we can deal with the fold reduction in response to the South African and the Brazilian variants. That's why you need very high titers. In addition to that, we don't know how long 1 vaccine will last in terms of resistance, immunity. And we don't know about T-cell responses yet. So it's important. We still need to get 2 doses. But the good news is 1 dose is 80% effective in the short term, so that's a good thing. There was also a study in the New England Journal that was from UCSD and UCLA that looked at 37,000 healthcare workers. And in that case, they had about almost 400 people got infected, but 71% of those became infected within the first 2 weeks of the first vaccine. So they weren't really protected. And only 7 tested positive 15 days after the second dose. So again, very effective in the real world with a high-risk population, healthcare workers. There was another paper from UT Southwestern in Dallas that showed they were looking at their 8,000 employees, only 4 tested positive after vaccination, after 2 doses. And there was another paper that looked at the antibodies that were generated. And this is a really interesting study. They looked at people who were infected, who had already been infected with SARS, and then vaccinated them versus people who had not been infected and vaccinated them. And the interesting thing is that the people who had never been infected but got vaccinated had titers to the spike protein that were almost as high as people who had natural infection and vaccination. So it shows how good the vaccine is at generating an antibody response. Of course, if you had the virus naturally, you had antibodies to other parts of the virus. They looked at nucleocapsid and a few other antigens, but so you develop a broader antibody response if you've been naturally infected, but you get a very high response with just the spike protein. In addition to that, there was a recent, just this past week, announcement by Pfizer that they looked at 1,200 volunteers of kids between the age of 12 and 15, and there was 100% protection in that group. So that's also now positive. When you think about it, the study said 16 and over. Now it's down to 12 and over, and we will be starting 2 pediatric studies, one with Pfizer, one Moderna, that will look at 5 to 12-year-olds. Those will be starting sometime towards the summer, probably early June. And that's really, really important because there are 48 million kids under the age of 12 in the United States. And if we need to get to herd immunity, we got to include a lot of those kids because they also represent a huge reservoir. So, this week was interesting. It was also a very important day for doctors. It was Doctors' Day. By the way, I've never heard of Doctors' Day. I don't know if this was the first Doctors' Day. Apparently, this isn't the first. But someone actually sent me a note saying Happy Doctors' Day. But when you think about it, we deserve a day because the people who've been in the front lines working all this time, really dedicating their lives to taking care of patients, the doctors and the nurses. But it's nice to celebrate doctors. So very happy that we had a Doctors' Day. Shout out to all the physicians at Baylor College of Medicine and frankly all in the Texas Medical Center and throughout the country. It's been a tough year for doctors, but they have really worked incredibly hard, especially those frontline doctors who are seeing patients every day. So I just want to say happy Doctors' Day to you all, and let's have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week. Medical alert.